right. So welcome to our session for the evening. As per usual, we are looking at the key textbook, leading, um, not leading, but
No, sir.
hi, hello. Okay, keep on hearing a little voice coming up there. All right, so we are looking at chapter two of the key textbook, and that chapter is titled, the name of the chapter is The Changing Nature of Leadership. So in this chapter, what we're going to spend some time looking at is how leadership is defined and the evolution of the concept and study of leadership through history in terms of how it's been looked at from the past into the current period in terms of how it it's expected to be viewed in terms of what's going on. All right, so is this large enough, guys? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, sir, I can.
Yep, it's fairly clear. I want to leave the names on the side so I can call on people or identify people who have questions or who want to make a comment based upon what we're looking at. All right, so let's start looking at this. The first thing that the chapter identifies is how leadership is looked upon. And one of the first things that they spoke about in that particular chapter was that leadership is often looked upon as something that is desirable and some sort of as the phrase is here, coveted phenomenon in society. Meaning that a lot of individuals aspire towards achieving positions of leadership. Now that leads us into another set of situations that come along. But a lot of us, especially at work, this this rise into leadership position often comes with increased access to financial resources and of course status in the organization. um, Therefore it's looked upon as something to be looked upon to get and achieve over time as some form of growth and potential growth in the organization. From a broader perspective, arriving in positions of leadership may lead to an increase in the amount of power and influence that you have, and therefore there's another reason why a lot of people look at this type of thing as something that is desirable by everybody. Now, the other people in the organization will look upon it from different perspectives. Some people revere leaders and other people hate leaders. And again, you have to come by that situation because that's in the natural type of variation in perception about what leadership is. Now, the biggest observation made by Burns here is that leadership is one of the most observed but least understood phenomena in the world. And that's simply because leadership is an intangible concept. It's not something you could touch or measure that type of stuff, but it's something that you see happening around you, and whether or not there's some dynamics or physical things you could touch on about it, it doesn't quite exist. So that's something that we have to understand, that the concept of leadership is kind of elusive in nature. And we have to deal with that as part of trying to define what leadership is all about. Now, because of its importance, obviously, leadership is studied extensively, especially in the modern time frame. We find ourselves, for example, looking at all of these different programs that exist in there, and I just have a few here. And the reason why I have these in particular, for example, you are going to use part of the leadership experience by Richard Daff. That's in this this course. I didn't put the existing one that we have. I have the Seven Habits of Highly Effective People because it's one of the programs I did. I'm also very familiar with Tony Robbins and his program as well. The executive leadership program as well is something that was utilized in the college from time to time, and I also did another executive leadership program using which was called the leadership challenge. So that's something that uh, because it's so important, leadership studies is kind of like a massive amount of money spent on leadership training throughout the various industries outside there. Now, how many of you have, by any um, through your own experience, have dealt with these or other programs outside there? Have any of you all done some leadership studies in the past? They need not be the ones that you see here, but um, most organizations, if you're working and they have started to earmark people for leadership roles in the organization, will have a tendency to point you into those types of studies. But I'm not sure if any of you all have any prior experience with that. Nobody? All right, we'll move along. All right, now the problem with leadership is, again, because of its elusive nature, it becomes difficult to define because most times leadership changes based upon the circumstances in which they have to operate. That's one of the big problems to start with. Secondly, because people have such different perspectives of what leadership is, then it creates more difficulties in trying to nail down what leadership is all about. So you'd see how leadership is viewed differently by different people in different countries and different cultures. So the way in which people around the world look at leadership varies. The, the responsiveness that people have towards leadership and their concerns about it also creates problems in terms of nailing down definitions. Now, we know that the model that we're looking at has a specific definition. We'll get back to that when we look at chapter 3, when we begin to look at the specific model we are going to be working with. But it creates a problem in the overall study of leadership because it is problematic in the sense that because of the variations, it creates difficulties in trying to encapsulate some sort of overarching study of a particular type, this particular phenomenon, if we can't agree upon what it is to begin with. All right. So, regardless of our perception and our feelings about leadership, our biggest requirement from all leaders is that they get involved with solving the problems that face us in our societies. So, I have listed a couple of them here, and I want you all to think about, besides the ones I have listed here, are there any others that you see that are of main concern to us? So I have climate change, globalization, poverty, access to healthcare, education, and other public services critical to basic survival. Can you see anything else here that is of a critical nature and something we look to our leaders to try and solve? Destiny, any thoughts on that?
No, sir.
No, you don't see anything else that as a people we should be getting in. Cappy, what do you think? So your hand up,
So
Cappy.
what
So
comes to mind is the crime situation.
right, so crime is an important one. Somebody else had their hand up, and who was that? Go ahead and open your mic.
Was it was me, Sir Jody
Right,
Marie.
right.
Maybe. Oh wait, hold on. Let me make sure you didn't say that. Maybe privacy concerns and AI,
Ooh,
things like that.
yes, that's an emerging issue. Yes, um, it falls into the area of crime, but it's very specific in cybercrime. People losing their or losing access, and you have ransom software um, coming up, and that type of stuff, and identity theft. Those are some interesting concepts. Yes, that's another concern I would probably have. Welcome, Zoe. Um, Zoyan or Zoan. Sorry, you get that right. Um, All right. So yes, these are the situation is that we are looking to our leaders to provide solutions and to provide a way of dealing with these issues. These issues are not simple. They are very massive. They're very problematic. Um, their dimensions are like if we look at climate change and globalization, those are well beyond the scope of influence of, let's say, a leader here in Trinidad or in any one particular country. So therefore, we are hoping that leaders worldwide get together and organize themselves to be able to tackle some of these issues that that plague most of the civilization around us. Now, the problem that comes up with that, because of the nature of these types of problems, if we just look at the criminal crime issue here in Trinidad and Tobago, very often solutions are not achieved, and that creates some massive problems for us because we begin to lose trust in the individuals who are placed in these positions of leadership. Welcome, Muriel. And that creates a problem. It creates a sort of reaction to leaders of despair and distrust. And that creates what the authors of this text talk about, the anti leadership vaccine. That is a situation in which we find ourselves with confronted by the issue of the nature of individuals who position themselves, especially in political leadership. So what we find happening is that people who are probably best suited to taking up leadership positions don't do it because they are of they not afraid, but they just don't want to take on the problems associated with that leadership position because of the level of frustration and the difficulty of living a life under the microscope of the society that you're operating in. I mean, if any of you all have ever been in a situation where you are a leader in an organization, you'd find every little thing you do becomes um, a point of evaluation, becomes a point of criticism. Any decision that you made might be questioned, and that creates some serious problems for the individuals participating or willing to participate in the activity. Wow, mine is taking a while to get in here. You guys hearing me, right? Everything's running smoothly.
Yes, sir.
All right. Just looking at her having problems there. It might be because of my system or Wi-Fi. All right. So we understand this situation that for far too long, especially in the political sphere, the people who are willing to take on the responsibility of running for office are not necessarily people who are really qualified to do it. It's one of the reasons why you find in parliaments that the elected people don't necessarily take on the role of ministerial positions. I don't know if you've ever realized that, but that's one of the reasons why a lot of governments bring in external help of people they perceive as being better qualified to run an office because the facing the electorate is a different set of tools required for work in that field. Running for office and running an office is two different things. And interestingly enough, what we find is sometimes some really distasteful people find themselves running for office in the party, and it 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 asks us, well, is this the best we can do? And the reason for that is this anti-leadership vaccine. Because of the circumstances that or the way in which we end up treating our leaders, it discourages those more qualified individuals from joining us, joining the leadership activities or the leadership of the party. Do you all find that to be the case um, in terms of the quality of individuals coming forward for positions of authority?
Yes, sir, I would say so.
Hmm. In fact, in the public sector, there's a phenomenon referred to as the Peters principle, which is the greater your level of incompetence, the higher up the organization you find yourself. And the reason for that is and this is something I observed in the teaching service because I experienced it myself. We had teachers who were problematic in terms of how they worked with students, and they would do a lot of damage in the classroom that impacted everybody's ability in our classrooms to actually get work done. Those teachers were quickly put into administration, which means kind of promote them upwards. So the reason why they were promoted upwards and out of the classroom was to avoid or reduce the impact they were likely going to have on the really the crux of the activity, which means get them away from students. Unfortunately, that means you have these people who are incompetent in the teaching of the subject, or teaching in general, finding themselves in positions of authority, and therefore then telling people, you need to be doing this to get the best results, when in fact they were, the worst examples of teachers in the first place. I've seen that happen in the teaching service. So I guess it's also happening in the wider public sector. I'm not so sure that it can be tolerated in the private sector, sorry, um, where performance and your capacity for getting things done is going to be a higher measurement. I don't know. I'd have to ask people from the private sector who work in the private sector to give me some sort of scenarios as to what might be taking place there. Anybody willing to contribute there? Do you find that Peter's principle operating where you work in the private sector? No, nobody's willing to share. Who here works in private sector? I know Miss Thomas. Both Miss Thomases work in private sector. No, Miss Thomas and Miss Williams. Anybody else? No? Wow. Okay. Maya's having real problems here. Yeah.
So is it that you're asking, for the private sector,
Yeah, what's
have
happening?
it?
Yeah,
Oh,
that's what I'm asking for. What's happening in the private sector? I haven't worked in the private sector for a very long time. Um, so I'm not sure, but I have seen some things like that happen in private sector activities. That kind of
where
Peter's principle.
the least competent you are, the higher position that you have, that.
Yeah, that you kind of end up in positions of power in an organization because you're trying to get them away from the front office. So you put them in
Right.
the back office to look after things rather than give them those kind of positions where they're likely to harm the organization. I don't know,
Yeah.
but I
But
know
sir,
that. Go ahead.
is that anything, associated with somewhat like seniority, where
Correct.
you
Yeah,
advance because
it's
you've been there,
for a
a
long time.
certain amount of year, yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
not
yeah.
necessarily because of merit, because you've taken, leadership courses and you've done this MBA and whatever, but yeah, generally because you've been there, so you deserve this job. I've more
Yeah,
seen that in public sector, but in the private sector, well, especially for film, I haven't seen.
yeah.
I haven't seen that. I've more seen nepotism. I've seen
Right.
that,
That's a different
but
form. Yeah.
I haven't necessarily seen the other way. Yeah,
Right.
what you were referring.
Okay, that makes sense though. But nepotism also is part of the whole process that that creates distrust with leadership, because people
Mm-hmm.
arrive in positions of leadership because not of what they can do and what their capacity is, but really because they are part of that inner circle, and that's also one of the things that leaders do, or that leadership deals with, and helps to chip away at the trust that people may have for the organizational leadership, the executive leadership of the organization. That's actually something that we have to pay attention to. All right. So the amount of research that has been conducted therefore provides us with some information that we can utilize to dispel some of the myths that have been developed about leadership over time. Let's look at what these myths are. Some of the myths are leaders are born, not made. We have heard about that one. Leadership is hierarchical in nature, and that you have to have a formal position within an organization to be considered a leader. You must have charisma to be an effective leader. That there's one way of leading, and um, you can't be a manager and a leader simultaneously. Why? What's happening with my brain? And you only need common sense to be a good leader. All right. So these are the myths that the research has been telling us about the nature of things. So let's start to look at the truths as opposed to the myths. Leaders are made, not born. This is the truth. The truth is that although you may come from a family that has traditionally been leaders in an organization, it doesn't mean that you have leadership capacity. In fact, if you don't pay attention to preparing yourself with training and the required skills and expertise, you will never become a good leader. Now, that's something I've actually seen take place in private sector in particular, where we're dealing with family businesses. So you have a family business that emerges as being very successful, generally because of the activities of one of the primary people in the organization. But the children who inherit the organizational, they inherit the business. They become, what's the word I want to use, right? They assume that they're going to end up on the board of directors or on the board of management, and they begin to take things for granted. They don't do the prep work that's required. They don't listen and go and do some training and better themselves. They just figure that they can get things done because as my father who started this business, so or my mother that started this business, so therefore I can run it, and they don't put in the necessary work. And I've seen far too many firms and companies, local and otherwise, fail from this capacity. And it's not because it's primarily because although you were born into a position where leadership was potential was very high, there was no preparation, there was no skill development, there was no training, or the training and development wasn't taken seriously. And I've seen that happen a lot of times. So therefore, this myth of leaders are born is nonsensical, because you can be born into a situation of power, but you have to work at keeping it. You have to get ready for it. You have to train for it. This is one of the reasons why, um, if any of you all are aware of this, kings and queens, for example, they go to very specific schools and education systems to be able to prepare for the eventual um, um, assumption of duties as a royal. Um, so you don't necessarily hear about those things.
Sir, you saw that on The Crown.
Nope, I've actually observed that from real life. I know, for example, a couple of we've had a couple of lecturers here. Are any of you all familiar with Eton College? You
Yes, from The Crown.
from the Crown. Eton College is a college that it's only landed gentry can go there in terms of preparation, because the nature of that school is designed to prepare people for taking up the role of royalty, for taking up leadership positions. So again, it's about training people, and because of the exclusive nature of where they're going, and the the jobs and activities they're going to get up to, it's part of the gambit that they have to run. Plus, they also have to kind of also apprentice into the position by serving under the queen or the king based upon what they're doing as well. Um, wow, Maya's having a bad day, boy. She can't seem to get into the class. Anybody can reach out to her and find out what's going on. somebody from maybe from her group. But no, I didn't get this from the Crown. I actually haven't looked at that series. We've had the fortunate or interesting circumstance of having a lecturer here in Costa who um, taught or not taught, but he was trained or went to school in Eton. Um, he actually used to teach in your department, Jody. Um, he got ill and he left eventually. But he was a real character, I have to say, because he had very limited what's going on to use the word, respect for some of the decision making that took place in the organization. It was very he spoke his mind. Let's put it that way, and that's something that that preparatory school prepares them to do. Speak your mind, all right. Especially if you are convinced that your opinion is correct. All right. The second element here about the hierarchical leadership in an organization is also something that is um, something that did she get it? Damn it! No, she didn't. Um, is also interesting as well because here we're talking about the way in which organizations um, have flattened their organizational structures to get away from hierarchical systems because when you centralize decision making, it creates bureaucracy in an organization that makes it inefficient. Most modern organizations have started to flatten their organizations to make decision making faster and closer to the point at which the actual solutions could be worked out. All right, so you can't leave decision making at one place, let's say up at executive management levels, when the operational areas is where the decision needs to be taking place. And you need somebody who is aware of what is going wrong to make that decision. So therefore, even in organizations that have these so-called hierarchical natures or what we call pyramid approach to organization, they have a tendency now to try and make small sub teams and groups within the organization to assist with that flattening process. So the very best organizations have become more flat in their structure as opposed to the strict command and command or line structure that exists, or what we call permanent structure that existed, where all authority rests at the top, and everybody else has to wait on that decision from the top to be able to act. It's sort of like how things work in governments. Governments have this very pyramid approach to making decisions. All right. So that is another thing that's happening in most organizations as they flatten things out. And even in those companies that still maintain some sort of hierarchical systems, they're beginning to realize that they have to break these structures down to make them more flexible, and in order to make the organization more dynamic in its operations, to be able to respond to changes in the environment quickly. All right, charisma. Now, charisma is a very problematic issue, and we will deal with it a few times in this chapter. And the reason why charisma is problematic is therefore not a prerequisite for leadership is because charisma in itself creates issues because charisma is subjective in nature. Charismatic leaders have, as the author here talks about, Yukil, profound and unusual effects on followers. They may be seen as visionaries who have strong desires for power, and they can easily motivate others to achieve those desires. The problem that we face with charismatic leaders is that oftentimes what they want to get to is not necessarily something that is best for everybody. All right. Um, and the correlation between successful leaders and their charisma levels is there's no real correlation there. You have had lots of good leaders without being charismatic in nature. All right. So the problem with this is that we've seen lots of examples of people who had high levels of charisma, but they really created a lot of problems. This is what Drucker is talking about here. That in the previous century, the three most charismatic leaders inflicted the most amount of suffering on the human race, and he listed them: Hitler, Stalin, and Mao. Now, we've met Hitler and Stalin in the previous chapter. Now, Chairman Mao, anybody's familiar with who Chairman Mao is? Mm? All right, so Chairman Mao he's the person who led China into communism and into the current system that it operates, which is the communist state. But during that journey into or transition into the communist China, millions of Chinese individuals perished from one of the first things that they perished from was starvation, and then of course from the re-education programs that took place where they tried to stamp out any sort of anti-communist feelings in the country. So a lot of people were died, and some were murdered, and that type of stuff. So, and all because of they have a vision, and they decided to get there regardless of everybody else's point of view. So, and they did whatever they thought was necessary. So here we have some charismatic leaders. So we have Hitler in up here. We have Mahatma Gandhi, who led India to independence from the British, but was very saddened when India and Pakistan were created by the division of the country. In fact, that was something that he was absolutely against. If you're curious about that, there's the biography of Mahatma Gandhi that was done as um, the film Gandhi. So if you want, you could look at that. Lots of material on Hitler, so you could look at that whole issue. Um, you also have Martin Luther King here, who was again active in the um, the the what do you call it? The civil rights movements in the United States, and of course he inspired a lot of people through his charismatic activities. So much so that he was executed for it or assassinated because of fears that he would, um, create even more unrest in the country based upon what he was doing. Anybody recognizes this shaded gentleman on the, well, that's my left? Anybody? Very charismatic person. Nobody recognizes the Reverend Jim Jones? Anybody knows what Jim Jones is famous for or infamous for?
No, sir.
You don't know? Are you familiar with the Jonestown massacres in Guyana?
Yes, sir.
That's the gentleman that was responsible for that. Remember the whole mass suicides in Guyana, in Jonestown?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Right. Okay. So there are lots of films about him too, and how he ended up where he started and how he ended up getting there. But charisma was part of the thing that they talked about. He was a very highly charismatic individual who, interestingly enough, it wasn't. You'd think, that it was, weak people that he was able to attract into his fold and, get them into believing what he was doing there was the right thing. But it wasn't. It was a lot of intelligent people, highly trained individuals who were marginalized by the society they were living in, and this turned out to be the United States. And he was able to manipulate them and make them feel as if his point of view was the only point of view that was correct, and therefore he led them into this destructive cycle. And he's not the only one, interestingly enough. If you want to see or look at another individual who falls into the category of Jim Jones, um, you might want to look into the the branch Davidian activities with David Koresh. And remember, some of you may not have been alive when this took place, but have you ever heard about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians? Anybody? No? You know what's amazing about the Branch Davidians? And I think I'll change the slide and add him here at some point in time to bring it kind of up to date. Was that the entire fiasco was televised. Um, this is where um, the ATF went in to try and to get a hold of him because they suspected him of of harboring arms and ammunition for resale and distribution, and they made a bungle of it. They got kept out of the compound, and eventually the compound caught fire, and almost everybody died in the fire. It's quite something. And David Koresh was the leader of that organization, and he was able to take these again m- um, marginalized individuals from society, bring them into this group, convince them that they had no more rights to sleep with their their wives, and he was the only person that was allowed to breed children, and not only their wives but also their children as well, their female children. He basically had the idea that he was the second coming, and all this kind of nonsense. It was really ridiculous that people. Yes, Dominique.
Hi, sir.
Uh huh.
So we're talking about charismatic leaders. All
Mm-hmm.
of this reminded me of is like cult leaders
Correct.
because a lot of people could say, even myself, be like, how could people fall for like such an obvious thing? And apparently, it's because they're just so. When you meet them in real life, they're apparently just so charismatic that you just
Correct.
believe
Ex-
everything they say.
and that is why the statement here is that charismatic leaders have unusual and profound influences on people, which is why charisma is such a dangerous thing. All right, makes sense now. All right, Sidru, that is an excellent point because yes, a lot of charismatic leaders have been associated over time with various cults that have existed and have grown up. You have the Moonies, you have the um, yeah, we have this whole group of them in Japan that believe that the end of the world was 2000, and they eventually did mass suicides. Or I mean, follow up on those kind of end of days cultures or cults, and you'd see a lot of them coming up all over the place. All right, no, so let's leave the charismatic people because we'll come back to that in a minute. There's not one any right way to lead. Leadership is primarily a very subjective activity, and the leader's style would come out of various things like their own sets of influences, their environment, their personal experiences, their cultural identity, their gender, um, their personal value system, their ethical values. So, and we are going to see that the different styles are actually going to be required to be an effective leader. You can't just use any one particular style, but a combination of different styles to match the circumstance or the context in which you're getting involved with it. So that's an important thing. Now, you can't be a manager and a leader. That was the myth. What what the theory really starts to speak about is that yes, you can be both a manager and a leader, but most times you're not doing these things simultaneously. That because managers are so beholden to the organization and the organization's objectives, they can't really necessarily be acting for the best interest of developing better relationships and looking after their followers and so on. That's not quite true. I'm pretty certain that most of you all have worked with people who are both good managers and good leaders. And the fact of the matter is that the the theory starts to tell us that even leaders who are managers don't act as leaders or managers all the time. In the day-to-day activities, a leader might engage in leadership activity maybe about 20% of the time that they're actually in the office and doing things. They may be more acting along the lines of a managerial and dealing with administrative activities such as like setting up timetables, scheduling, granting people's leave and that type of stuff. Those are managerial things. Acting as a leader means that they are interacting with their people, helping them deal with some issues, dealing with motivational problems. Those are the type of leadership activities that you're going to find them getting involved with. And that means there are times when the manager will act as a manager, and there are times that the leader will, the person will also act as a leader. So those are kind of things that you want to pay attention to. So yes, you can be both a manager and a leader. They're not mutually exclusive activities, all right, in an organization. The main focus, however, is that when the person is dealing with what is required of the organization and its objectives, that tends to be where the managerial activities take place. But in so doing, they have to behave like a leader in order to motivate, encourage, and help the people around them, the subordinate staff and so on, to accomplish these things by dealing with their issues, you know. I'm pretty certain that you've been able to go into an office with your manager and talk about a problem you're having. You know, they're simply there like what's the word about it? A counselor who's just simply going to listen and say to you, listen, I know you're having a rough time. Um, can you think you want some additional days off, that type of stuff to help deal with these things? This is the kind of activities that a leader gets involved with their people about, as opposed to, you know, when they call you into a meeting and they start to talk about, well, we haven't seen this quota being met, we've noticed a certain falling out in this, or we just want to indicate that you've been doing quite a good job. You know, both reward and punishment and corrective activities. Those are the kind of things that you want to focus on and have that. So, again, they're both combinations of management and leadership activities. So, those distinctions are not hard and fast. They overlap, and as a result, you can be both a leader and a manager. All right. If this fact here wasn't true, then there's no reason for us doing this course. Let's just end this whole discussion right here. Leadership is teachable. All right. If we if leadership wasn't a teachable thing, if it was that you were born with everything you were required to be a leader, then this course would not exist. So let's stop the argument one time. All right. That I mean, there is a debate on this that you all will engage in, and I'd love to see the arguments coming up that debunks this concept. And interestingly enough, in several debates, people have won the debate that leaders are born as. Just saying, just we'll see how that works out. All right, so let's start to look at how leadership is defined. So, evidence of the word leadership or the word leader first being utilized started in about the 1300s. So now what we have to pay attention to here is um, context. What's taking place during the periods when these things come up. So we'll track some of these things and then we'll start to look at the context in which they're taking place in. All right. So the word leader emerges in the English language in the 1300s. This is where Middle English was kind of settling out into more modern day English or Old English, as the case would be. And the word leadership emerged in the 1800s. This is where language is kind of like um, coalescing and becoming more regularized. All right. But primarily in the 1800s, leadership was ascribed to already political activities. All right. Few definitions existed prior to that of leadership. There were a few that started to come up from the 1900s to 1929 or so. After that, a lot more attention was paid to leadership and leadership studies, as we're going to see in terms of the nature of the definition that comes up. By the 1980s, we've had 110 different definitions coming out from academia. Then we have 221 definitions found in books, like what we see there, general publications and other scholarly material. And then we have 366 publications on leadership that don't include a definition. So they were talking about leadership from a very generic type of activity that they don't necessarily define what leadership is all about. All right. So one of the early definitions from Mumford, and again we're talking about 1906 here, define leadership as the preeminence of one or a few individuals in a group in the process of controlling of societal process of control of societal phenomena. So this definition here speaks to a concept of that we've heard about. It's called master of puppets, and this tends to be a kind of dark approach to defining what leaders are, because they're kind of like sitting in the background manipulating people to get things done in the way. And if this kind of reminds me a little bit of another book that comes up in relation to leadership and how leaders ought to behave. For those of you who might be knowledgeable about this is the um, oh man, I can't. It's slipping my mind right now. I should put these in my notes. Um, uh, it'll come. I'll find it. It'll come. It's a letter written to, in the form, a book written to a king by his advisor in relation to how he ought to behave in relation to um, uh, how he should be as a leader and what he should do with his followers and stuff like that. But anyway, it's very Machiavellian, right? Okay. So Machiavelli, the Machiavellian book, that is what we're referring to. So in essence, this preeminence of one or few over the group is kind of Machiavellian in nature, and really is a kind of like a dark side of this definition, and it it does in fact speak to this kind of controlling factor, and that's where the definition started from, as opposed to that type of definition that a lot of people still ascribe to. Contemporary definitions focus on the relationship between the leader and the people around them, his followers or his well his associates, achieving mutually agreed upon goals and actions. All right, so that is a massive switch from the master of puppets to the sage on the side type of thing, um, definition that we have there, and that the type of interaction is also one that is closer in nature, as opposed to the secretive approach from the background, from behind the scenes type of activity that we talk about in the past. All right. So in fact, in the textbook, they referred to the Wizard of Oz, who was this guy who was hidden in a back room, operating all these machines to try and manipulate people around him, that kind of stuff, by doing certain things. It was quite an interesting chapter, part of the chapter when I was reading about this element. So the master puppets comes to me from the point of view of the way, because if you think about it from perspectives of the earlier time frames in the 1800s and the 1900s, the concept of a strong individual. So if you look at a lot of those films coming out of or depicting life in that period where you had monarchs and the papacy being the the authorities in most countries, you'd recognize that the strength of the individual manipulating what was taking place in the background was the way in which things were done in the past, and the strength of the individual was important. But those individuals, of course, were selected and chosen to be leaders based upon things like their heritage and their birthright and that type of stuff. And this actually then features in the type of theories that we're going to be looking at. So one of the things that we have to pay attention is what is the context in which these theories and definitions are coming out of. So as we move through the time frames, we're going to see that contemporary ideas will contemporary at the time of their emergence will impact negatively or positively on the nature of the concepts and ideas that come out. So especially when we start to use sociology and psychology to 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 really evaluate what's taking place, especially source and psych. Those areas have a massive impact on the way in which we looked at leadership and how we practice it or how we evaluated it in the past. And they in fact, um, did have a massive impact upon the um, the way in which the theories were developed. All right, and we'll see how that's working on. Now, again, we have to look at the context in which these things were taking place, and this is going to be a critical thing that we want to look at. So, in order to try and make these definitions a little more understandable, instead of just trying to define something, we use a metaphor. So, most of us would know from basic English that in order to make something clearer, a writer often uses a metaphor or simile to be able to compare the activities that they're trying to describe with something that might should be generally known by the audience that you're dealing with. So you have these types of metaphors that they utilize over time: the administrative, the competitive market, consensus, anarchy, independent judiciary, and so on. These these types of metaphors were utilized to be able to describe what leaderships and how leadership is defined. Now, the one that we want to pay a little more attention to is the common contemporary metaphor of a leader being um, involved in an orchestra. So in this situation here, we can see a mass of individuals doing different things. Some are, all playing instruments of some sort. This is the conductor in the middle. Some of them don't even seem to be looking at him, but he's in charge. It is his responsibility to get the best out of each one of these individuals and to ensure that they have a really good performance that will please the audience. So, this metaphorical definition of the orchestral leader is supposedly going to be one of the stronger um, or more vibrant types of metaphors that exist out there. But if we break this down a little bit, as Dupree talks about here, he likes the use of a jazz musicians to look at this metaphor. And in this case, what he's describing here is that okay, Naomi's having the same issue now. Are you guys still hearing me properly? I'm seeing more and more people having this issue. Guys? Yes? All right, Gabriel.
Yes, sir.
Okay. If anybody could contact Naomi, it might be her Wi-Fi or something giving trouble. Because I didn't see this other girl get back in by now. Sucks. Alright, so look at what this jazz band leader has to do. He must choose the music, find the right musicians, and then do the performance. In public, of course. The effect of the performance depends on other things too: the environment in which they're playing, the volunteers who are playing in the band, the need for everybody to perform at their best as an individual, but more importantly, as at their best within the group, with the group kind of thing. The absolute dependence of the leader on the members of the band and the members of the band on the leader. So it's a reciprocal type of relationship. And Dupree sees this as a great summary of a leader in operation in an organization. Now, how many of you here, if anybody, has any sort of musical background or participates in like in a choir, plays in a band, plays an instrument? Let's start with just the instrument. How many people here might play an instrument? Nobody. Nobody plays pan. We had carnival just go off there. Nobody played pan for carnival. There's no musicians among us. Wow, that sucks. Okay, nobody, nobody here plays music. And suppose everybody here listens to music, right? So does this metaphor speak to you, any of you all at all? Anybody here was part of a choir? Let's start with something simple as just using your voice. In church or in school, that kind of stuff.
Yes, sir.
Who's the yes sir there?
Ayana.
Ayana. So what voice did you do in terms of were you a
I can't
temp?
remember the name of it, but it wasn't the lowest, it wasn't the highest, it was like in the middle.
Right, okay. All right, so baritone or somewhere along those lines. And how did you feel working in in the choir?
It was a good experience itself. Um, yeah, singing and performing and stuff was good, but dealing with the people wasn't, the most fun. But
Dealing
I
with the people was not necessarily most fun.
yeah,
Okay, but it was still required, wasn't it?
yeah, it was nice. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it was still required. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
because you can't perform by yourself unless you're doing a solo act.
yeah,
And even if you're doing a solo act, you still, unless you're your own musician as well, you still needed music to back you up. Yes?
exactly. Yes.
Have you ever thought of continuing that line of activity?
Yes, I have,
And
but it was just a thought.
it's just well, you never know. You still have time. You're young yet. All right, you can still get involved in things, but understand the type of whoever the leader of your choir was. Was it a teacher? Or was it a leader in your church group, or what was it?
A teacher.
All right. So consider all the things the teacher had to put in place to get you all to perform. She had to find some music, right? Did you all perform only church type stuff, or did you all do contemporary music as well?
No, it was for our graduation. I was in like primary school, and it was for standard five graduation. Alicia Jagasa, she was our teacher.
I'm not sure if the name sounds
No,
familiar, but I'm not sure if I know her.
okay,
What school is
why
this now?
Newton Girls?
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
and
All right.
yeah, it was in front. I think it was in Napa,
All right.
so it was a
Okay.
big, a good thing.
It was a big to do.
Yeah.
All right. Hopefully you all did a good job. Have you ever heard recordings of your performances?
No, I don't think so.
These days with parents, everything is pull out the phone and record it, right?
Yeah.
It's unbelievable that that didn't happen at your time. All right. Well, thanks for sharing. I really enjoyed that because unlike you, I started in a choir when I was in primary school, like yourself. Went on to be in choirs in secondary school as well.
Oh,
In
okay.
in school, I started to learn to play pan, and I started to learn to play guitar. For some reason, I never could afford to buy. Well, actually, the instrument I was really training on was trumpet, and my trumpet teacher died.
Oh my.
And then, well, I mean, he was an elderly gentleman, but when he died, I ended up with his trumpet, but no person to train me. So I started to play guitar because my mom bought the bought us a guitar at home, so I started to play that and started to teach myself, and that's what I recognized that I can actually teach myself how to play the instrument. And then once I did that, I got involved with music with other students, and we made a band, and we started to play out and perform. And then when when I went to university, I joined a band there, and we started to perform all over the place and that kind of
Wow.
stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, eventually I ended up playing bass guitar in a soca band and performed on the road for carnival a few times, and that was interesting.
Okay, so you carried it
Tired.
straight through.
Right. So, and it starts with one thing, but every time you get involved, if especially the larger the organization structure that you work with, you start to recognize that the leader of the band has so much to do, and they're highly dependent on everybody else around you. So like in some instances, I was the leader of some of the units that we were looking at, and I gave that leadership up when I wanted to focus more on my music, my capacity as a musician rather than having to deal with that. That's one of the reasons why bands have managers. It's to actually get the to have the headache of leadership activities in terms of like booking gigs, getting those kind of things sorted out, and having somebody deal with that issue separately. So really, this metaphor of the musician and the leadership in the form of a musician is really important because it kind of brings to bear all of the different challenges that leaders have to face in terms of getting things to work. All right. Another place that we could use another metaphor is the sports team metaphor. Now, there's a couple of guys here. Anybody here into football in particular? Soccer or football, depending upon how you want to call it. Favorite teams? What about the ladies? Any of the ladies into football? These days, everybody's into football. Nobody. Why is it that we're not getting an Idris, you're not into football at all?
Not really.
What sports are you into? What sporting activity?
I, w- I watch a lot of boxing and, well, UFC.
Okay, all right, but and already that is the end result of a team when the fighters meet, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you. Nobody else into football at all? Wow. So I can't even use the sports metaphor, the team metaphor, because you recognize something about teams. There's a tendency to for us to fantasize with sports, to pull all the best players together in to one team and let them play the rest of the world. And interestingly enough, one of the problems with when you have um, this team versus the rest of the world kind of situation is that you have a bunch of really skilled individuals, but they are not capable of operating as a team. Whereas you might have a group of less talented individuals, but they are able to outperform even these highly skilled individualistic players because the team is stronger than any one individual can be. And that's the truth about leadership as well. The A strong leader would recognize the strengths and weaknesses of his team and therefore build the team to be the strongest it can be, especially if they're going to be able to withstand the skills of individuals in the opposing teams. Now, not saying that the individuals can't perform better, but think about how much stronger they will be or better their performances will be if the team has the capacity to output to add to that person's performance. Think of Portugal, for example. Had Portugal always had um, um, Ronaldo in his thing in his group, but they were never able to win the World Cup because the team around him wasn't strong enough to support his skill levels. Cristiano Ronaldo. Y'all familiar with that, right? Yeah, I guess you all follow the World Cup, right? At least some of you all look at the World Cup. The ladies would have at least looked at the World Cup to see all these guys, right? Maybe, possibly. No. Wow. This lack of any comment really bad. Anyway, whole point being is that despite having some of the world's best players as individuals in the team, unless they were able to work together, they were not able to be successful. That's really the point I'm trying to make, and that is the gambit of or the area of the leader. The leader is required to do a lot more in those kind of circumstances. All right, so we talked a lot about this metaphor about the leadership of the jazz performers and stuff like that. So we could look at that in different times. The other metaphor is the episodic. We talked about this already. That at any point in time, leaders do not participate in leadership types of activities every second or every day. They are doing leadership activities a little at a time. So 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there, something. So it's referred to as leadership via episodic affair. And that kind of makes sense. If you are in a leadership position in an organization, your leadership activity is not everything that you do. You sit down there and you're working out something privately on your own. That's not leadership. But it means that from time to time you would engage in activities that are non non-leadership in nature, and other times that you will be engaged in some sort of leadership activity. So that's the episodic metaphor. That leadership is an episodic phenomenon. It takes place in spurts and spurts and dashes, basically across the board. All right. So that makes sense there across the board in terms of those metaphors that they're talking about. All right. Okay. Now, theories about leadership. So, first off, we need to understand that leadership is a complex and elusive phenomenon. It's one of those intangible things that is difficult for us to look at. Secondly, it requires different sets of disciplines to look at the one activity. That's because leadership has multiple skills and disciplines that is called upon by the individual to utilize when they are acting in leadership positions. And therefore, it will, in fact, especially call upon behavioral and social activities. What engineering actually refers to as soft skills, people skills. And as Ayana spoke about before, working with people in any sort of circumstance is difficult because, interestingly enough, everybody's different and everybody thinks differently, and we need to understand them. And this, which is why a lot of the theories that we're going to be looking at will really sit upon behavioral science and social sciences a lot to be able to get into it. So, a lot of the work has to focus on the psychology of the situation and the sociology of the situation, and it's therefore through time it's developed in with a lot of studies have been taking place and developing a lot of theories that actually exist in the current circumstances. So we're going to be going through some of those theories now. These are the theories that we're going to be looking at, and what I want us to pay attention to is the context in which these theories emerged. You probably see what I'm looking at here. So we're going to be looking at all these different theories here. Great man, trait, behavioral, situational, influence theories, reciprocal leadership, chaos theories. And then we're going to look at the last one we're going to look at is, uh, oh, well, when we get to it, we'll see it, all right? Because the name of, so the great man theory. So first off, these theories, or the great man approach to theories, emerged out during the period when Darwin's theories of evolution were dominant in the um, in the mainstay of education, or in terms of the academic climate. So anybody's familiar with Darwin and his theories of evolution? Remember, this was the beginning of when man came from ape, kind of thing, right? His theory was actually referred to as the theory of natural selection, and the premise of it was that the strongest will survive. That particular organism which could withstand the pressures of um, the evolutionary pressure will exist, will win out in terms of existence, which is where they started to talk about the different techniques. You all are familiar with this, right?
So like
Yes.
eugenics.
Very good, excellent, because this was the beginning of eugenics. The theories, Darwinistic thinking led to the theory of eugenics, and eugenics has a very interesting twist on it, and we're going to see that coming up in the next approach. So the great man approach comes from this Darwinistic thinking, and first came up in the early 19th century. Right now, it was based upon the concept of leadership based upon hereditary properties. So that meant that great men were people from the same family who reigned as kings and queens. Well, we're primarily going to talk about the men in this because, as you will see, or as you might be aware, um, the woman's status in society coming out of the 18th century into the 19th century was very limited. Um, if your father wasn't known, you were a bastard. You have to remember that. If you had no father, then you were ostracized as a bastard in society, which meant that the father who was really important in determining the your ability to continue the bloodline, so to speak. All right. So here you have these brothers who were kings ascribing to have special powers and abilities and influence, and therefore, in order to maintain that particular um, line, they would intermarry and produce more of that superior aristocratic class. Now we know what happens to people if they inbreed. Anybody can tell me what happens to people when they inbreed? That means you have children with your cousins and your second cousins and unfortunately your
So they end
sister.
up with like birth defects and stuff.
Well, it creates a lot of difficulties, yes. The birth defects are one, but there are others. Primarily, it's going to weaken, create the issues with their brains and have trauma and that type of stuff. But it means that what ends up happening with inbreeding is that it weakens the the lineage. So now that's the first thing. So it meant that if you look at this, great men can only be great men if their fathers were great. Does that make sense? And their father's father was great. That kind of stuff. So what happened to the great women in history? Well, generally the theory ignored them. They were aberrations that were not necessarily that needed no explanation because exactly they were aberrations. So people like Joan of Arc, Catherine the Great, Queen Elizabeth the First, and so on, they were ignored by this theory because they weren't male, and therefore they weren't important. And remember that Mary Queen of Scots, all of those people come to mind in relation to that. Um, this was the beginning of that whole thing about the genes, the bloodline becomes important. Anybody ever saw or read the book, well, you might have looked at the Da Vinci Code, which kind of harps on this a little bit, but the book that I'm thinking of is the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, where they talked about, or where they postulated that the bloodline of Jesus Christ exists in the modern world today because Jesus had a baby or a child with Mary Magdalene. You all familiar with this concept?
I
No?
think that is so.
Did you all ever look at the Da Vinci Code? That film? All right, another film for you. Go and look at the Da Vinci Code because it's loosely based on the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. All right, but the concept there is all about bloodlines, and bloodlines are carried by the male of the family, not the female. That was the important distinction that this theory really sits upon. So therefore, only men could be leaders. Of course, this theory didn't really hold for very long, and that then led to the later part of the 1900s, where they gave up on the great man and led to the traits approach. Now, this is where eugenics starts to play a part because in eugenics, what they're saying is that there are a number of different traits that the individuals will have that will set them aside as being leaders. All right. So leadership was dependent not on who the leader was, but on the characteristics of those seen as leaders. So what were these things? There was a particular trait such as intelligence, height, self-confidence, that differentiated them from non-leaders and thus made them successful. What is not spoken about in the text but is implied because eugenics is part of the process here. It also referred that one, they were male, two, they were white, three, they had blue eyes, they had blonde hair, or they had brown hair. But they couldn't be dark skinned, they couldn't be Jewish, they couldn't be African American. Well, we didn't have African American back at that point into that thing. They couldn't be Chinese, they couldn't be Hindus, they couldn't be anything else but white Aryans. And that's what eugenics spoke about, or alludes to. Now, research, hardcore research, failed to produce this list of traits that ensured that this person with this list of traits will be automatically a leader. So this concept of genetics and genetic theory kind of failed on this. Now, if we remember what's happening, we're talking about a time frame just in the 1800s. What was going on in the early 1800s was World War One, and that was and coming out of World War One, we had that eugenics um, concept being very popular coming up into World War Two, and we're going to see another distinction in theories at that point in time, because up to this time frame, up to World War Two, these were the concepts as to how people ended up in particular leadership positions. Now, the trait theory was the one that discarded the great man theory for want of trying to find this list. And if you look at this list, this was something that Hitler was looking for in his people. Now, of course, here you had the leader of the Nazi revolution or the Nazi movement, who himself was short, dark-haired, and thing, telling people that in order for you to be a leader, you must have high levels of intelligence, which Hitler was acclaimed to have, a lot of charisma, short, very high in self-confidence. So the only aspect there was, that probably was different was that he wasn't necessarily full Aryan, and that was something that was also talked about as well. But the concept of eugenics was so overwhelming that was one of the things that the Nazis during World War II experimented on the populations to see what would happen if they were to mix this and do that. And there was some horrible things that was going on. So if you read about um, um, the Auschwitz and the other death camps and stuff, you would recognize that a lot of medical treatment and experimentation took place where they did lots of really cruel things, all to check this theory of eugenics. And this is why, Anya, when you spoke about eugenics, that was the prevailing thinking at that point in time. That it was the genes or these characteristics coming from the bloodline that helped to create these leaders. And therefore, if they were to have these particular genetics, they totally ignored anything else in terms of what makes for a good leader kind of situation. Now, after World War II, um, the approaches started to change by looking at behavioral approaches. So this is where um, instead of looking at who the managers were or what were the traits of those managers, what they started to look at was the behaviors of managers and behaviors of leaders and try to make correlate their effectiveness with what they did. Now, again, we're going to see that these theories started to develop in the 50s and the 60s. So again, the World War II ended in about 1945. What was taking place in the world then was a great, what we call the reconstruction of the world, because if you remember, um, the only country that didn't get a lot of damage from World War II was the United States. Largely, they were kind of left off the hit list, but the most of Europe and parts of Africa and the Asian Middle Eastern areas were damaged significantly by the war efforts in Europe over that period of time. So the entire area was engaged in rebuilding, and they were also dealing with the fallout of population. So during this time frame, you'd find that the the thinking about how business ran was very industrial in nature. So they focused their attention on looking at how factories and industries worked, and they looked at those places that had what they referred to as productive output taking place, and therefore evaluated the behaviors of those leaders in managerial positions, or leaders in organizations that were having successful outcomes, and looking at what they were doing right or what they were doing, period, and trying to correlate what they did with their effectiveness and leadership. So these theories were developed in the 50s and 60s. So again, now we are after World War II at this point in time. The thinking is industrial revolution. The thinking is rebuilding. So if we think about what's taking place, this is the period of the 50s to the six to the early 60s, where there was a lot of economic growth taking place both in Europe and in the United States, because this is largely after the World War II, where Reconstruction was taking place, and the United States was taking over as the leading nation in the world. That's also something that also begins to influence the context in which theory and the studies were approaching. So this is why you have Ohio State University and the Michigan State University producing these key theories. So they were referred to as this theory here is the manager um, behavioral theories, and in which they determined that there were two main activities that managers would engage in: considering activities and engaging structure or initiating structure activities. So basically, consideration was described as any sort of activity that was supportive to the employer, or to the employees or subordinates, all right, where you were looking out for for their peace of mind and their benefit and their welfare. So those are considering activities. And then the second one, initiating structure, the degree to which a leader defines and structures his or her own role and the roles of subordinates towards the attainment of the organizational goals. So they further classified that these dimensions or concepts were separate and independent of each other, and therefore they were neither positive nor negative in terms of the effect. So basically, here you had a bunch of scientists in lab coats with clipboards coming into your office or into your factory, and they would have these grids or matrix on their sheets, and they're taking note of any activity that you engaged in as a manager or leader or supervisor, and you're trying to differentiate between which one were initiating structure activities and which one were consideration activities, and therefore kind of did check marks back and forth, so on, and taking note of what, and trying to correlate those things as to what makes an effective leader as opposed to what is not an effective leader, kind of stuff. Second model, Blake and Morton, these were some European guys. They came up with another two-factor approach, or what theorists would refer as um, bivariate approach. Concern for people, concern for production. Same kind of issue, same kind of thing. Their model looked at how much activity, how much time they spent in actions that were showing concern for people, as opposed to those that shows concern for production, and the results from it just simply says effective managers showed high concern for people and production. No definitive statement, no kind of um, critical conclusion. Um, Michigan studies on leadership behavior included the identification of relationships among leaders, behaviors, groups of measure. Oh, hold on. Who that? Zoe, your mic is on.
Sorry.
That's okay. You're not sounding very well though. How are you?
I had the flu for 2 weeks now. Sorry.
Have you gone to the hospital yet? Or to your doctor?
No.
You need to.
My mom
That's
asked me the same thing.
that is too long to have that type of thing, and you're going to be exacerbated by the Sahara dust. You can get yourself seriously ill and damaged like that. Please go see your doctor ASAP. Sounds like you need to be on antibiotics. All right. So, right. So you have this study here that instead of just looking at two variables, they decided to look at three different variables. You have task-oriented behaviors, relationship-oriented behaviors, and participative behaviors. Wow. So instead of a bivariate, you have a multivariate theory that's coming up. So regardless of which you're looking at, bivariate or multivariate, the main thing that was happening with this is that the information being collected was really just it 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 was inconclusive. It meant that it didn't really say anything about what somebody should do or ought to do to be a better leader. More importantly, the approaches in terms of only looking at behavior ignored the context in which this leadership was activity was taking place, and therefore there was a lack of correlation between the nature of the activity with the types of behaviors that come up with it. So again, as a result, these theories ended up being inconclusive and inconsistent because they weren't able to to come to the same conclusions given every circumstance that they apply these approaches to. So that, of course, meant that the behavioral science, this early behavioral theories were having some serious problems in terms of their application. Now, recognizing that the situation has a part to play moved us from behavioral to situational contingency approaches. Now, in this approach, they had to pay attention now to the situation or context in which these behaviors were being studied. And they determined that, let's look at it. The situation determines who will emerge as leader, the leader being the product of the situation. So they're now trying to say, okay, they're going to look at the situation, evaluate the behaviors of everybody, and those things will give rise to who's the natural leader that emerges in the thing. So, how do the effects of leadership vary from situation to situation? So that's another thing. So contingency theory, of course, as I said, tries to take into this situation all the different variables, including the circumstance in which they're operating in. So, two major theories came up. Firstly, the least preferred co-worker. Wow, that's a really nice name. The least preferred co-worker. So, in essence, what you're trying to do with this model is to find the worst person to work with and observe their behaviors, in essence, right? And therefore, the leader or the supervisor in that particular case would have to be able to moderate the situation or describes how the situation moderates the relationship between leaders, traits, and effectiveness. So it's a kind of weird model, to put it this way. This is mid 60s, right? So coming out of the and well, into that period of the early 60s, 65, 64, still in that period of regrowth, but approaching some revolutionary periods as well. Then you have the path goal theory, which originated in 1956, but then being applied across the board into the 60s, right? So this one speaks to the uh, there being two paths to the ultimate goal of organizational success, which is people have personal goals that they want to achieve, and the organization has its goals that it wants to achieve. So the task of the leader, therefore, is to increase the personal rewards of the subordinates to um, make them want to perform in the organizational activities to be able to get to their own personal goals. So this is like the beginning of motivational theory. So this is where Maslow and others will start to come in. So basically, what you do in order to get people to to do what you want them to do, you hang in front of them the goal that they have, their personal goal. So you say to them, okay, if you get all of this stuff done, you will earn the goal at the end of the day of increased wages, increased time off, whatever personal goal that that individual had. So this is the beginning of the carrot on a stick mentality or approach to leadership here. So what you had to do is to manipulate people by saying to them, you you will get to the at the end of this activity you will get your reward, which is this carrot that you had hanging on a stick. So I, mean, I know a lot of you all might have met this kind of motivational approach to things. So you don't get to the stick unless you get, sorry, you don't get to the carrot unless you finish all of the things that the organization wants. It's kind of like you know what, like you getting a degree. The only way you can get your degree is by passing all of these courses. So the motivational hang for you is the attainment of your degree. But in order to get your degree, you have to do these, how many, 60 courses or no, it's not, sorry, 60 courses, but 62 credits or 120 credits or whatever credit count you have. You have to accomplish all those things. But at the end of the day, the goal is for you to get your degree. Now, the motivation moving along the way is what the manager has to pay attention to. And his job becomes that motivational approach. So, the easiest thing for you to do is to use a transactional approach to things, which is say, okay, at the end of the day, you're going to get X. And when you get X, that's how things will work out. All right? When we get X, then you get your reward. So that's the nature of the path goal theory, which is, as I said, it was the beginning of that whole concept of motivational theory and that type of stuff. Early motivational theory comes from this type of activities. Again, problems with these theories was that there was a lack of supporting research because, again, the concept of social sciences was at its earliest stages, and therefore its development was in the the beginning stages, which created some problems. Um, Learning how to be scientific in the way in which they collected data and so on was going to be part of the problem that they had to engage in, and therefore they were developing their processes in terms of how to do social science research. And that, of course, led to a lot of issues with um, the outcomes of their findings. So again, the outcomes were inconclusive and they were um, uh, indeterminate. So there was a problem with them across the board, and they didn't really say anything much about what leaders needed to do in order to get these things done. So again, so here we are, we're coming out of that now, and into that we want to bring influence theory. Now, this was another move over because this actually took us into the 70s as well. But it first started with Max Weber. Some of you all may recognize this name. He started his studies into to influence theory, particularly in relation to charisma, in 1924 and 1947. Those are very significant dates, guys, because this kind of punctuates the beginning of the situation that led to World War II and the end of World War II. And again, he was looking at leaders with high levels of charisma that really had negative impacts on the world at that point in time. Of course, you'd remember that Hitler was seen as the Antichrist back at that point because of the amount of damage that he brought to bear on the world. So he started this investigation into the concept of charisma and its impact on leadership, and he was trying to use that in the managerial context to describe the form of influence based not on traditional power or formal power or authority, but rather on followers' perceptions of what that leader means to them, kind of thing. So again, this is the whole problem with charisma, and Max Weber was the first to really write about it or publish on it, which was charisma, not charisma. Charisma has to do more with how followers respond to somebody as opposed to how um, what the leader does. Okay, more importantly. Now we have to think about this from this particular perspective. Germany was in from 1924 on to 19 thing. Uh, an entire country of people selected a leader based upon his ability to answer the questions that they had about why their world was bad. Because after World War One, which was termed actually the Great War, um, Germany had to pay recompense to the rest of the world. They had to pay back repercussions or reparations had to be paid, and that led to great economic um, problems in Germany. In fact, it was the first time that they recognized or observed what we call hyperinflation taking place. Now, I'm borrowing this from economics because I'm also an econ teacher as well. It was the first time that money lost value so rapidly that um, the German mark had no value and they were able to actually pay off their debt, but with useless money. But it meant that the country was suffered and they were not allowed to rearm, which meant they weren't allowed to build back up their military forces and that type of stuff during that period. And during that period of hardship, Hitler was able to bring to bear to these people the concept that Jews were responsible for why we were where we were. Got people to believe and to accept that his explanation as to why they were where they were, who's to blame for it, and more importantly, how we get out of it and how do we ensure that Germany rises to the maximum power that it can. You had a whole nation following this guy based upon charisma, and this is why Max Weber spent some time studying this gentleman because of the profound influence he was able to have on an entire population and by extension the rest of the world based upon his ability to convince a nation to make him the emperor of Germany, so to speak. Because when he was chancellor for life, that meant he could never be replaced until he died. All right, and he became the leader of Germany and led them into World War II, or led the whole world into World War II by his own thing. So by 1977, Robert House started to look at this theory with more interest as well, and he started to make a set of observations about the theory. And these testable variables here, he started to say things like this. So based upon his research, he started to look at it's attributed to leaders by their followers. First off, charisma is something that a leader doesn't naturally give to himself, but people give it to him. And more importantly, is that those things were given to him, or there was a greater possibility that charismatic leaders come to the forefront when the situation in which they arise calls for change or calls for movement away from the status quo. Because that's the other thing that they talk about. Several theories exist that posit charismatic, right? So this part here, charismatic leadership includes times of crisis and times when followers are willing to challenge the status quo. Now, this is really important because only during these periods of, well, pockets of instability take place, when there is crisis in society, you find these charismatic leaders coming up. And again, as we've seen through history, not all charismatic leaders have altruistic goals, right? So we had a charismatic leader in Martin Luther King, but his goal was altruistic in the sense that he was looking for non-violent methods of getting the black population of the United States in recognized as people and not second class citizens. Him, Malcolm X, and all the other leaders from the Black Power movement or the civil rights movement in the United States. But again, you had charismatic leaders who had alternatives. So again, starting with Hitler, then we had Stalin. We talked about Chairman Mao and the other thing, because in each instance, these individuals rose to power during a period of high levels of conflict where people were facing a lot of hardships and they were looking for answers to the problems they were having. And these people came up and presented in a charismatic manner the solutions that appealed to the vast majority of individuals. So, in essence, we have seen things like that happen in the last elections with the United States, where well, not the last one, but the previous elections where Trump won. You can see that kind of charismatic fear mongering taking place because a large group of the United States looked at Obama as the end of their world, and therefore they saw it as a crisis situation. Because how dare we have an African American or worse yet, because everybody assumed he was Muslim, um, president in office, and these people were the minority in that country. How was that possible? So, in reaction to that, you had this fear mongering that took place that led to the emergence of Donald Trump coming up as president of the United States. So, again, now I find him personally very um, kind of cheap kind of politician type of tactics that he has. But for a lot of people, he's charismatic. And yes, I can understand that because he appeals to the persons in their audience at their level. And that helps to make them want to support him. Now, fortunately, I mean, didn't do a lot of damage, but consider other circumstances in which more damage could have been done or could take place based upon the same type of issue that comes with influence theory. So, influence theory really tries to understand and capture this thinking that we have to pay attention to what these individuals, how people are responding to these individuals, as opposed to only paying attention to the charisma of the individual. And we also have to pay attention to what is their ultimate goals. Because if we don't question and hold them up for for justification, we can find ourselves getting into a situation where you're following a leader who um, has a very skewed view of what the world should be like. So, too much deference to individual leaders by followers creates a dangerous scenario where leaders misuse power or deliver vision with an empty dream. And that's the takeaway from charismatic or influence theories that existed during that period of time. So again, we could look at the context because the 70s as well, where Robert House was doing this work, you had a couple of cults that were developing at that point in time. The Moonies and um, this guy that we spoke about before, Jonestown, that type of stuff. All those kind of things, those charismatic leadership activities was being observed during that period of time. And again, a lot of times we don't see the end result that these leaders are looking at, but we see more along the lines of um, we don't see their end result until it's a bit late. But the ideas are there. It's just we're not looking at them, and for some reason or the other. Some people can see it if you really pay attention to what the person's saying, and that's the danger too. Huh? Charismatic leaders come up and they start spouting off, and then people ignore them as dismiss them as a quack or whatnot, and then eventually they become a problem because nobody was taking them seriously until, of course, they were able to get the kind of following necessary to move them to that position. All right, so now we have the emergence of the reciprocal leadership theories in the 1970s. Now, can anybody talk to me about what was taking place in the 1970s? Anybody remembers the from history, what was going on in the 70s in the world, late 60s into 70s. Too far back? It's only about 50 years, 53 years, 54. No? Come on. One thing you know from the 70s. Let me ask Denise. No. Unbelievable.
Excuse me, sir.
Uh-huh.
I just remember a while just older, right? But women's rights
Correct,
and stuff.
yes. Uh-huh. All right, so good. That's a good start. Anything else? Anybody wants to add? Women's rights and activism was coming up. Adult suffrage was coming up as well. Was during that period as well. Anybody else? The 60s into the 70s was a period of profound social change, especially in the way in which it was done, because it was encapsulated in a period when there was a massive amount of distrust being exhibited to authority figures. So we think about in the United States, for example, at that period of time, there was the movement against war, especially the movement against war in Vietnam, and that whole era of anti war movements. Alongside the anti war movements, you had the flower power movement or the hippie movement, as other people talk about. And alongside that hippie movement, you had the women's liberation movement beginning during that period and growing. And that was also in um, well, we should say bookend by the musical revolution of the British invasion of rock and roll and that type of stuff taking place, the flower power movement, and of course the increase in hallucinogen drug use as well taking place during this period of time. During this period of time, also, you had a lot of people investigating alternative types of culture, especially so Western culture was being challenged by ideas coming from the Eastern cultures, so from China, from India in particular, and from Japan. And those concepts and ideas were being brought across and being taught. And this is during this period of time, you also had the development of a lot of occult movements that were taking place as well. And a lot of change and revolution was taking place during this period of time. So that's the mindset of individuals during this period of time. And the reciprocal theories began to, from what I'm looking at here, reflected that type of thinking. So the reciprocal leadership theories emerged focusing more on the relationship between leaders and followers, and that mutual understanding of what was taking place. The focal point now was more on how do we move together as a people? How do we get leaders and followers? How do we bring people to a better life rather than one group versus the other kind of situation? So the reciprocal leadership theory really sat on that particular sharing of values, sharing of power, sharing of authority, because again, we're coming out of a period with a high amount of distrust for authority figures in government in particular. And anybody who represented the status quo um, would be part of this whole process. And again, this extended into the civil rights movement going on right across the board from the 60s into the 70s. You had the emergence of the Black Power movement as well, the Black Panthers and all that type of stuff. All of this was during that period of time as well. So a great period of revolutionary change was taking place and in all fronts across both the United States and Europe. And by extension, it influenced activities everywhere around the world. In the 1970s, here in Trinidad, we engaged in the Black Power movement here as well, resulting in the 1970s Black Power Revolution, which led to a lot of problems here for the population and for the country, because we went into a long period of what they call it, boy, curfews and all that type of stuff. Armed revolt in Trinidad. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, right? All right, so that was the 1970s. So what theories came up? Let's look at them. So the three most popular theories that come up is the transformational leadership theory, the servant leadership theory, and the followership theory. They're all very similar to each other, and they all speak to probably the same things. Now, you all are going to be looking at servant leadership theory and transformational leadership in a lot more detail in a couple of the chapters that you're going to be dealing with. So and we talked about followership before, and some of the other things here. So let's have a look at that, the basic theories. So 1978, we have Burns here, defines transformational leadership as a process where leaders and followers raise one another to higher levels of morality and motivation. So this is the concept here. We together as one make the world a better place. Get the idea? And that was a kind of Eastern culture. Everybody's getting together and we're doing, kind of like we are the world situation that we're talking about here. Sorry, my bad. All right. So all of these theories are really thinking about bringing people together for a better world around us. So let's look at the second quotation here. Leaders appeal to followers higher ideals and moral values such as liberty, justice, equality, peace, and humanitarianism, not to the lesser emotions such as fear, greed, jealousy, and hatred. So here you had leaders appealing to their followers because of the higher ideals they had. Position today's type of leadership and the behaviors that they get up to in terms of the types of things that they do. I find in today's environment, the focal point of of leaders is to point out why we shouldn't be supporting everybody else because you're afraid that they're going to do this and you're afraid that they're going to do that. So this concept of fear is driving the whole leadership activity that's going on currently in a lot of instances, especially when we look at political leadership. All right, not that we are getting together to make the world a better place kind of situation. Not that's the kind of situation. But that was the backbone of the transformational leadership theory. In relation to how that works out, so we can see a lot of things coming up from this. So there's a lot of motivational theory comes out of this. Um, a lot of followership theory. The followership comes up from this as well. So let's look quickly at this because we have another set of theories to look at as well here. But we again think about the context in which this is taking place, and why these again how the environment and the context of the world around us influences the thinking of the behaviorist theories during this period of time. Of course, by this time they're getting much better at doing social behavioral studies, employing more of a scientific approach to things rather than the more observational approach that they were utilizing before. All right. So all of these unique characteristics that they're talking about in terms of leaders are designed to transform followers into and leaders both into something better. So ethics and ethical values start to become very important during this period as well. So again, um, at, at at that point in time, corporate greed and distrust about the objectives of um, of governments, those kind of things were being really doubted by the wider population, and they were looking for something better, and these were the theories that were coming up. So these are the kind of transformational leaders that emerged or are examples of leadership. We've met all of these people in the past before, in other contexts, in other like the last chapter we had these things coming up before. So I'm not going to go through these guys again. So transformational leadership was contrasted by Burns with transactional leadership. And what we start to identify here is that a lot of people seem to think that transactional leadership is better than transformational. In fact, you all will. This is one of the topics you can debate from the thing that Transactional and transformational leadership, one is superior than the next. But in essence, transformational leadership is one where you try to motivate people into becoming something or move an organization into something better by appealing to people's higher standards. Transactional leadership, on the other hand, is about setting up basically transactions or contracts with individuals to encourage them to make a change. All right. Now, what we're going to find is that when we start to look at it, is that all forms of leadership have value, and that different circumstances require different types of leadership activities. So, transformational leadership, by a lot of people, is seen as being more of a higher level type of leadership than transactional, because transactional tends to focus on individual goal achievement, whereas transformational looks at group and social development across the board, not for any one person's personal gain over the others. All right. So that's something along the lines of what you're talking about. Oh, problems with transformational theory and is that it kind of lacks a lot of um, clarity and specific issues or specific outcomes. Kind of reminiscent of the fact that maybe when they were writing up these theories or creating these theories, they weren't focused on the specifics, but were already more on the spirit of what was going on. Might have been all that narcotics that they were using during that period of time. All right, servant leadership theory. This one postulates the concept or the idea that the leader is a servant of those people in the organization. Servant leadership. You all will be dealing with this in a lot more detail than I'm going to be treating with here. In fact, I'm going to kind of move through very quickly at this point. The idea here, and I think, for example, um, one of our political leaders attempted this type of leadership approach in being a servant leader, where the objective or the purpose of the leader was to serve all the followers and lift them up by lifting their lives up and making them capable of taking charge of their lives and taking charge of the organization and moving them into leadership positions. So as you can see here, the servant, through focusing on the primary needs of others and the organization, then transforms himself or herself into a leader. That's the concept. The leader is the servant who facilitates the growth of the followers into becoming leaders themselves. That's the concept, the idea that goes on. All right. So we had, I think, one of our politicians attempted this move, and it didn't go well. I mean, it played well from the press point of view in terms of um, in terms of how it sounded to the wider population, but the problem was follow through, because I don't think enough of her immediate cabinet and ministerial appointees really subscribe to this servant leadership model. I don't, primarily because, well, people are selfish. Yeah, let's put it that way. To be honest, people are primarily selfish. They're looking out for themselves, and this is really a good theory, and it's a good way in which to run an organization or to be as a leader. But the problem with it is that it's difficult for people to give up personal interest in terms of being a servant leader. Um, it's a really nice idea, but it's really a problem that she faced when she tried that. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, when the UNC under um, Miss Kamala Bessar won the elections, I think it was in 2010 or something like that. Um, she, if you remember the mantra that she was using, service, service, service. This is the model I think she was utilizing. She didn't come on outright and say it, but this is the model that I think came up from it, or where it came from. But as I said, without buy-in from the other leaders in the organization, it didn't work across the board for the people there. Any thoughts on that, guys? Anybody? Nobody. Oh, okay. All right. So remember, you all have to do the same thing too when you're presenting. Huh? All right. So in essence, at the end of the day, the theory is that the servant leader becomes irrelevant. That you empower the followers to the point that they are independent and they themselves become leaders and you become irrelevant. But your job is to make yourself irrelevant. That's a really weird one, right? So followership. This is the other theory that they talked about here. Um, Instead of looking at your followers as sheep, we start to look at them as really um, a set of individuals through which you will empower them to become the future leaders and everything. So that's followership model. So the focus of this model is to switch from looking and focusing on what the leader does, which is which comes from that industrialized mode of looking at leadership activities, to focusing on the role and activities of followers. So I think we have a whole set of things that we talked about here. You want to move them from being alienated to be from to yes to sheep to yes to being effective followers. So that's the whole kind of thing that you want to do, and you don't want we met this model before where we had a matrix that shows the thing. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to move your followership into being um, highly critical, independent individuals capable of acting on their own decisions and looking at the overall good of the organization or the good of the group that you're with. That type of effective followership things. These followers will be able to manage themselves well, commit, be highly committed to the organization and to its functions or purpose and goals, that they will be able to build their expertise and focus their efforts on maximum impact. They're courageous, honest, and credible. These are the types of followers that you want to have. Um, the reciprocal nature of this type of thing is that everybody's working together and the benefit of one benefits everybody else. So basically, again, followers are helping each other to be better. So again, it's a very altruistic approach to leadership, that the follower and the leaders are both supporting each other and lifting each other up to be better versions of themselves and making sure that what they do is positive, is held to the highest um, ethical values, and therefore we are all working together in moving forward. All right. All right. So some of the paradigms that we're shifting from. So a lot, if not most, of the theories that we looked at sits upon that concept of industrialization. So if you think about the education system, for example, our education system here in Trinidad is still highly focused on what the industry needs. In fact, most of the times when we do program evaluations, one of the things that we always do is a program advisement committee. That committee is usually made up of the employers who are utilizing our students from the programs. So the problem with that is we're still, a lot of organizations are still very focused on output orientation, meaning that what they're primarily concerned is making sure that the market, the resource that they have coming in, the student body that is, or their resources, their human resources, are able to perform in the context of their jobs to produce the best outcome, which provides the most amount of profit. Now, that paradigm of industrialization is an old paradigm. Should have been left alone back in the 80s, but it still maintains today. And you can see it in the shape of classrooms and the shape of schools um, around us. So if you look at the way in which a classroom is set up, all the desks, and if you think about your primary schools and where your children might be or where what you remember from the past, all the desks and chairs are set up in rows, one person behind the next. It's very orderly. You shut up and you listen. When the teacher is speaking, you don't say anything. Sort of like what you're doing now. Oops, somebody's trying to get in. So you all agree with that? That you ought to be staying quiet and listening to what I am have to say, and you're not allowed to speak your mind, right? That's correct. Sorry, yeah, Crystal, go ahead.
I think
If
we
I
have
say so.
that in.
All right. So unfortunately, no, that's not right. The approach that we need to be looking at has to be able to encompass massive amount of change because the current situation is not that way. If we look at the 21st century that we're in now, that industrial revolution theories, they are badly shaped for what we face now. Because look at those theories, they were structural functionalism. Let me say this again. Those theories in that industrial era were structural functionalists, management oriented, personalistic, personalistic and focused only on the leader, goal achievement dominated, self-interested and individualistic in outlook, male oriented, utilitarian and materialistic in ethical perspectives, and rationalistic, technocratic, linear, quantitative, and scientific in language and methodology. So, what does that mean? What is that statement? I pulled this out of that text, and it speaks to me from the context of how our education system is developed and how leadership is approached in our almost ancient system, and that's why it's referred to as a paradigm. Structuralist and functionalist, meaning that they were designed to fit into hierarchical structures and they function to serve that structure. Management oriented, it means that in all of these structures there are managers, and we are either going to be training people to become managers or you will be trained to stay as a servant in that system. Personalistic can focus only on the leader, which means that the entire theory focuses its attention on what the leader does to the exclusion of thinking about what is the behaviors of the followers. As long as you are doing what they want, they don't really care. You could do anything else as long as you do what I need you done. That is the only care of the theory. Goal achievement dominated, which means the only job I need this manager to do is to achieve the profits necessary for the country, for the company or the organization. Self-interested. I am only interested in what I need done. I don't care about anybody else. I don't care about what society thinks. I don't care about if the goods that I make damages or poisons the world. Male oriented. We keep on talking about this a lot because a lot of current management thought talks about this glass ceiling, and that's the glass ceiling that it's referring to because women rise in organizations, but they stop at a particular level. So you find that the vast majority of organizations are male oriented, and that glass ceiling is partly is not partly, but is reflected in the nature of the theories that emerge that support this type of behavior. Utilitarian and materialistic and ethical perspective. The only thing they care about is profit. The more profit I make, the better. That's the only thing that matters. There's no other ethical value that is of use. Think about Enron. Think about um, this company that went robbing people like Madoff and all that. The only thing is profit. The only thing is money, and the only thing is my profit. It's all right. The approach is rationalistic and technocratic, linear, quantitative, and scientific, and language and methodology. So all of this stuff is just pulled together. All the management theory, all the leadership theory is pulled together using rationalizations, technical language, linear equations, quantitative, statistical data, and everything is couched in scientific language. No care for people. No word on humanity. That's what the theories existed before. All right, and that's the problem that we're going to face. Now, reciprocal theories allowed us to try and make that shift from the industrial to the post-industrial period. Now, that is only part of the shift that is required. All right. We have to think about what is our current circumstances like, and I want to get to this really quick because this actually starts to tell us we are not living in the same world that we started our lives in. More importantly, the time frame when a lot of these theories is because remember I kept on asking you all, do you remember what was taking place in the 60s and 70s? Those time frames no longer exist. So why are we beholden to theories that emerged in circumstances back then when those circumstances or contexts do not exist anymore? The context has changed. So this is the reality that we are faced with. We are in a rapidly changing environment. Okay, if we think about just a couple of years ago when the pandemic came upon us, I would have been in a classroom with all of you all right now, and we would have been arguing with each other about all this stuff that was going on the board, and I'd probably be using markers and discussing things, and if any of you all have ever had me in a live class, it would have been a totally different circumstance and situation. Look at us now. We've changed and we continue to evolve and change based upon what's happening around us. All right. So they look at this quotation here from Slocum and Lutheran. Faced with an unprecedented economic, technological, social, socio-political, and moral ethical tumultuous sea of change, there is a need for new theories, new application, and just a plain new thinking about leadership. And that is true because the world around us now is not the same thing that we predicated a lot of those older theories on. The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of theories sits upon the idea that the world is stable and it's in a nice, neat, controllable environment. That is hogwash. We know that. I know how difficult it is as a person who suffers from a low level of OCD to come into an environment like one of the worst places for me is if I go into a kitchen and it's in a mess, I can't cook. I can't operate. I know, and there I mean many of you all who are like that. So, like right now, I have my nephew who's spending some time with us and he's a chef. But when I get into the kitchen, that kitchen is absolutely messy. I can't operate in it, and it's because he has several dishes going on simultaneously. Whereas my technique of cooking is, you know, prep, wash, prep, wash, start to cook, wash, clean, and keep the place tidy and thing. That's my thing. My world is a little more orderly. His a more creative environment, um, and I just need to step away from that kitchen when he's in his place and what he's doing. But understand, that's the world that we live in. The world that we live in is a chaotic mess. And if we can't create theory to deal with that situation, we are not going to be, uh, the theories that we have are not going to be relevant. Um, that lie we like to tell, that the world around us is nice and clear, and we would like that. We would love the world to be a nice, orderly place where everything falls in place and things are nice and cleanly understood. Not happening because that's not the world around us. All right. And that's the problem. The theories that we have sit upon this false belief that the world is a nice, neat, controllable environment. The world is filled with chaos, and one in which chaos is viewed as something to be embraced rather than feared. Now that's the problem. If we are in this type of ever-changing world, then we have to change to be able to accept that change is inevitable, and that rather than be fearful of change, that we need to embrace that change. And in order to embrace that change, we need to do a couple of things. And this is what these newer theories approaches. This is for those of you who might be familiar with this, is called chaos theory. Um, so chaos theory means that there's a different approach to leadership activities based upon that circumstance, and we have to be able to get our theories to be able to absorb or deal with change very quickly. All right. Now, So now we have to understand what chaos is. And chaos theory tells us that there are two really important things we have to look for. First is that there is an inherent pattern inside the apparent unpredictable activities that we're doing. And in order to get a handle on it, we have to look for certain things and do certain things to be able to do it. Now, one of the first things that they talk about in terms of dealing with this world is to look at the connections we make, the networks we create. And the second thing is pay attention to how the thing started. So we have to pay attention to what is called the initiating factor. How did this chaos start? All right, let me see if I can find that part here for you. Here, sensitivity to initial conditions. What took place at the beginning of this chaos? That's the initiating condition. It implies, because if we pay attention to that, it tells us something about how it is likely to resolve itself. It doesn't tell us everything that's going to happen, but it tells us what is likely to probably be expected moving forward. What is the initial condition? In order for us to be able to work through that situation, we have to pay attention to the relationships that we are dependent upon to be able to move through. We have to look at the connections and recognize how important those connections are. In fact, the model that we're looking at here refers to it as the concept of andness. Andness in the sense that you can't do anything on your own. So it's always going to be a number of things connected together or a number of people connected together, anding with each other. Now it sounds like a token rubbish here, but andness and anding is going to be something that we require because as the theory starts to move forward, and you all could download this and look at this in more detail, is that for us to arrive at solutions to the problems, not only do we have to pay attention to the initial circumstance and how we ended up there, but we have to look at all the possible methods of correcting or fixing the problems. And it can't be that we only take a right and wrong approach or an either or approach. It has to be that we have to look for the best of every different um, contribution and pull from it a number of partial solutions to come to a possible solution and not believe that our way is the only way. There are multiple ways of getting things done. All right? So we have to move away from that whole self-centered is either or, and we have to consider the andness of both answers being both wrong and both right. And we pull for what is partially right, all these partially right answers to get things done. So it sounds in itself a form like a form of chaos. All right, and in so doing, we are reacting to a situation where partial solutions exist, and we pull all these partial solutions together and come up with something that is likely to create an overall solution that will not necessarily deal with all of the problems or all of the challenges, but a vast majority of which allows us another set of opportunities now to find further solutions to the larger issue or the biggest problem. So we at the beginning we identified the crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago as being one of the big problems, and you'd recognize that that crime situation is a really critical and dynamic problem that's full of chaos and changes rapidly all the time in terms of what it will do, what's happening, and how it's doing. And we can't still be looking for a one approach solution to a big problem like this because it has so many um, there's so much places in which it comes up and there's so much different things that come up that we have to look at multiple partial solutions to the overall problem to be able to fix this thing. That makes sense? And that's what this chaos system talks about as well. All right. Like this quotation here, most problems facing communities, groups, and organizations are difficult and have no simple answers. If there is an answer that seems obvious, it will have to be tried sometime in the past or and may or may not succeed. And this is the problem. We always look for one fix, one and done, and that's a kind of um short-sighted approach or myopic approach to looking at the problems that we face because there are no simple answers to complicated issues. That's trying to, what we've what we're very good at is putting band-aids on problems and thinking that they are, in essence, basically we are just covering up the problem and we're not approaching the fundamental issues because those fundamental issues requires a great deal more investment and a great deal more of time and a great deal more of resources, and we're unwilling to do those things. And this is talking from a very broad political point of view that um, a lot of people don't want those problems to come to the forefront because it challenges my survival in the political environment, and that becomes your primary focus. And this is one of the reasons why I distrust a lot of politicians because their motivations are questionable. And I don't care which side of the divide we're talking about. Their motivations for getting involved with solutions for our society are questionable at the least. And the the solutions that they pushed us have been tried and failed so many times, and I still wonder why we're still trying the same things. And nothing new comes up. And those things that might sound new may not be new. They might have worked in the past, but they may not work now. And that's the issue. We're trying to utilize, you know, 1970 solutions for 2024 problems, and that the mismatch is serious and runs really badly um, done. And everybody has to be fully correct all the time. Not that there are partial solutions, and nobody else can have the correct idea. That kind of narrow-minded thinking is nonsensical. Where you have, and I see this all the time when we have elections and we have changes of government. Some of you all may have noticed this. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. So one government comes along and creates an institution or creates an idea, and they execute on it. And then they lose elections the next time around, or a couple years later, or whatnot. And the new regiment comes in and suspends that particular activity. Just cut it off, and no financing, no nothing. They're shutting it down because they don't agree with it. And then suddenly a similar idea comes up, but is rebranded under the new institution. That type of nonsense, I have no patience for it because you're wasting resources simply because you're trying to take ownership of a program to make it reap political points for your organization. That makes no sense. You're fooling only those people who want to be fooled at the end of the day. Um, and I've seen this happen from way back in the 80s when I really started to pay attention to politics and leadership and that type of activities. From since the 80s to now, I'm seeing the same things repeating itself over and over again. And the people who are participating, some of them, the same set of individuals from back then, still operating now. All right. Now, the problem with this theory and these approaches is that they may sound vague, and that vagueness does not lend itself to any sort of confidence. But the fact of the matter is that if we don't start to accept the world as this chaotic environment, we are bound to fail in terms of looking at the type of leadership practice and in terms of how we treat with the world around us. Now, that brings us to a different uh, model. This is the last model that we're looking at. This is authentic leadership models. A new development, this is from about the late 2000s, is a review of many reciprocal leadership models. So what they're doing in the authentic leadership models is they've gone back to the 70s and they've taken those reciprocal leadership or servant leadership models and kind of revised it in what they refer to as a post-industrial research mode, which means they've taken, again, the idea is that we don't need to find brand new solutions. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Look at what we have from the past, borrow from it what works, discard what doesn't. Kind of make sense? All right. So the problem I have with authentic leadership, though, is that it's extremely idealistic. All right. So starting from the very this part here, starting from a very basic point of view, authentic people are at the center of authentic leadership, and it is at the base of all positive, socially constructive forms of leadership. All right. Now that sorry, um, that starts the problem for me because it already positions itself as an extremely idealistic type of thing. So let's look at this description here. Um, Authentic leadership is described as the confluence of positive psychology, transformational leadership, and moral, ethical leadership. And the authentic leader as someone who is, listen to this list of, of things: confident, hopeful, optimistic, resilient, transparent, moral and ethical, future oriented, and gives priority to developing associates to be leaders. Wow, where are we finding people like that? And can we develop that in this model? It's possible, but honestly, I think a lot of this requires time. And so this is from 2003. This is the beginning of this model. So by now, this we here we're talking about 20 years later. Obviously, they're different situations, but this theory is really speaking to an ideal that we want as leadership for tomorrow, or for us now at this point in time. All right. So they go on to talk about authentic leaders as persons who have achieved high levels of authenticity in that they know who they are, what they believe and value, and they act upon those values and beliefs while transparently interacting with others. Now, I've never seen anybody in leadership positions behave in this manner, with this level of transparency. Um, they may know who they are, they may know what they believe, but a lot of times when they act on those values and beliefs, we don't know because some of the beliefs are not fully known. They're not being transparent. All right, there's hidden agendas. There are agendas behind agendas, and there are other people who are influencing your decision making by some form of manipulation. That's what it looks like, or that's what we see taking place on. So again, this theory I think ignores a lot of the issues that faces our cultures and our societies. At the root cause, a lot of corruption exists, a lot of gaff is taking place because everybody is seeking their own um, objectives. They want what they want, and this speaks to a very enlightened type of leadership which is able to resist that level of corruption and influence. And I don't know if we have, as a society, on a global standpoint, arrived at a situation or arrived in a position where we are mature enough to 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 accept or want to have leadership like this around us. Can we willingly give up our own desires and needs and wants to ensure that everybody around us is safe, is empowered, and is satisfied with life? I, I have serious issues with that and the nature of this theory. But what I do like this theory for is that it positions an idea as an ideal against which we can construct a reality to approach it. And that's at the end of the day, I think that's the best thing about this theory. Um, Across the board, you all could look at this in more details, authentic leadership, and it's all its descriptors. But this is the main thing that I always find with this theory. it's it's like it's too good to be true, but it's if we could get this, this would be so great. But the level of transparency, the level of honesty, and the level of selfishness, selflessness required for this, wow, it's unbelievable the work needed for something along these lines. And we have to also trust as well that the participants share the same ideals and they're not focused on only achieving what they want in their lives. Okay? All right. So the authentic leadership model is probably one of the newer models that's going on. And we're going to be looking at the derivative of all of these models where they apply in the next chapter that we're going to be looking at. So in essence, I'm hoping what you've gotten from this is the journey of what leadership was like and leadership idea and thought um, emerged through the years of study. As I said, I'm not going to be going into that much detail. So we did a lot of exploration here in terms of where leadership starts, the context in which leadership is taking place, the definitions, the nature of leadership, the world of chaos theory, and how we have to work at developing better theories to describe the type of world we're living in, because the world that existed in the past no longer exists in our current frame. All right. I don't need you, as I'm saying here, I don't need you to memorize any of this. What I need you to do is to kind of just grasp the concepts, take the ideas, move forward, see how much you believe in, how much you accept, um, um, and see how much you think would appeal to you as an individual in this particular journey that we're taking place here now. All right. Any questions, guys, on what we looked at? I know there's been a fair amount of material that we went through, but it was a very intense chapter. As you can see, it went through a lot of material. And the next presentation is no different. There's a lot of material that we will be going through. It'll be advisable if you can look at it before we actually do the presentation, so you can ask more pointed questions for clarification when needed. All right. Any questions on anything here, guys?
No questions from me, sir.
Well, you're not the only person here, but I'll open it
No,
up to
sir.
everybody. Everybody thinks they get everything, but
No,
you get
sir.
the idea of what I'm talking about rather than others. All right.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so we are just about 8:15. We have time. Anybody has any questions they want to ask, not related to what we did today, but related to other stuff for the course, for clarification or otherwise?
The
Yes.
presentation that we have to do, the group presentation, right? I know
It's
you
not a
said,
presentation. You are teaching the chapter to the class.
oh, okay, so it's like for the full 3 hours.
No, an hour and a half.
Okay, great. Thanks.
For each period that you have a maximum of an hour and a half to work with. All right.
Okay, okay.
Cool. All right. Good question, though. All right. Yes, Jody.
Okay, sir. Um, I think my group and I think we noticed something in the rubric that said we're expected potentially to give recommendations. Is it? I'm not.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's when necessary. Yeah. Recommendations based upon the material that you are reviewing with the class and you're teaching them as to what they can do to probably be better at it
Uh-huh.
based upon what you're doing. So, for example, what chapter you all dealing with?
5.
All right, that's
Understanding
understand
others.
others. All right, so one of the
Mm-hmm.
things you could encourage people to do as a recommendation is to go online and do the personality test, do a VARC
Yeah.
test, do those kind of things, make those kind of recommendations because it helps with understanding who you are and understanding why people think the way you are, which is why those tools are also available on the e-classroom.
Okay, so this is for like the overall chapter, not
Yeah.
necessarily for each kind of like section or something. It's just the
Yeah,
overall
no, it's
chapter.
overall recommendations. Like
Oh, okay.
you can't do sectional recommendations, unless there's a big point that you're trying to make out of it. But again, I tell you, put that down in your conclusion where you're making your recommendations there. Even if it was just one from a particular section of the material that you're covering, just add it into your conclusion and do it at that point, rather than doing recommendations all over the place. Cool?
Okay. Okay, thanks.
No problem. Anybody else? All right, so if there are no questions, let me stop this recording.